Hey everyone, so lately I've been deep diving Crusade related topics, and I discovered two obscure Crusades that I'd like to share with you guys. Anyway, let me know in the comments if you enjoy this video, because there's actually a few more that I'd like to cover if there's an interest. Also, as usual, don't forget to quickly hit the like and subscribe buttons and the notification bell. Generally, when we think about the Crusades, most of us picture armored knights riding toward Jerusalem and clashing with Muslim forces in the deserts of the Holy Land. And there's a good reason for this, since most of the major Crusades fit this mold, at least to a certain extent. But in the mid-13th century, the papacy directed the machinery of crusade against a target much closer to home. The crusade against Ezzolino da Romano wasn't fought against a non-Catholic, or fought over sacred ground in the Levant. It was fought in the cities and countryside of northeastern Italy, against a man the Church declared to be every bit as dangerous as any foreign enemy of Christendom. It's a story that reveals just how flexible the concept of crusading had become by this period, and how thoroughly political ambition could be dressed up in the language of religious duty. Ezzolino III da Romano was born on April 25, 1194, into a noble family that held territories in the March of Treviso, a region encompassing much of what we now call the Veneto. His father, Ezzolino II, controlled fiefs around Bassano and Treviso, and young Ezzolino grew up immersed in the violent factional politics that defined northern Italian life. By his early 30s, he'd inserted himself into the power struggles of Verona, backing certain noble factions against the local count, Richard of San Bonifacio. He became the ruler of Verona in 1226, and quickly proved himself a shrewd operator with a talent for conflict. Control of Verona was enormously important, because the city sat astride the Brenner Pass, the crucial Alpine route connecting Italy with the heartland of the Holy Roman Empire. Initially, Ezzolino sided with the Lombard League, the coalition of northern Italian cities opposing Emperor Frederick II. But when it became clear the League favored his rivals, particularly the Este and San Bonifacio families, he switched allegiance. In 1232, he and his brother Alberico struck an alliance with Frederick and received imperial protection. It was a massive gamble, but it paid off spectacularly when Frederick crushed the Lombard League at the Battle of Cortanova in 1237. Due to his shrewd alliance, Ezzolino emerged as the dominant power in northeastern Italy, at least so long as he had the backing of the supremely powerful emperor. He cemented the relationship by marrying one of Frederick's illegitimate daughters in 1238. From that point forward, Ezzolino served as the emperor's strongman in the region, holding Verona, Vicenza, and Padua under his iron grip. These holdings granted him incredible wealth and power, allowing him to raise substantial armies as he enforced the will of the emperor on his northern Italian subjects. Ezzolino's rule became synonymous with terror and extreme repression. He employed torture liberally against anyone he suspected of disloyalty, and carried out mass punishments that horrified even his contemporaries. At one point, distrusting the loyalty of Paduan conscripts in his militia, he reportedly had thousands of them imprisoned across his domains and executed. Even accounting for the exaggeration common in medieval chronicles, the scale of his brutality clearly made a deep impression on the populations he controlled. It's worth noting, however, that much of Ezzolino's fearsome reputation was shaped by writers who had every reason to make him look as monstrous as possible. The chroniclers who documented his rule were overwhelmingly Guelph partisans, hostile to the Ghibelline cause he represented. And just to jump into the narrative for a second, Guelphs were supporters of papal power in Italy, while the Ghibelline cause supported the Holy Roman Empire. When Emperor Frederick II died in December 1250, Ezzolino lost his most powerful patron, but remained strong enough to maintain his territories through sheer military dominance. The papacy saw an opportunity and Pope Innocent IV excommunicated Ezzolino in 1254, declaring him a heretic. This was a critical step, because it opened the door to treating the campaign against him not as ordinary warfare, but as a crusade, with all the spiritual incentives that entailed. Now, it's important to stress here that there's no evidence whatsoever to suggest that Ezzolino was promoting any heretical beliefs whatsoever. This appears to have been a raw power play by the Pope to shore up Guelph power in northern Italy against the forces of the Emperor. When Innocent died later that year, his successor, Pope Alexander IV, escalated things dramatically. Alexander IV formally proclaimed a crusade against Ezzolino in 1256, offering indulgences to participants. This meant that anyone who joined the fight would receive the same spiritual reward traditionally reserved for those who traveled to the Holy Land to battle for the recovery of Jerusalem. It was a remarkable development in the evolution of crusading ideology and highly controversial even at the time. The papacy was effectively telling Christians that fighting a fellow Italian nobleman in the plains of Lombardy was as meritorious in God's eyes as liberating the Holy Land. While we don't have exact records to indicate just how questionable the populace viewed this shift, given how absurd it sounds on its face, we can speculate that they didn't take it well. That said, there was glory, loot, and land at stake, even if the theological grounds were shaky, and unsurprisingly, Ezzolino had numerous enemies. The military leadership of the crusade fell to Azzo VII d'Este, head of one of the great Guelph families and a longtime bitter rival of the da Romano clan. The coalition assembled against Ezzolino was formidable, drawing support from Venice, Milan, Ferrara, Padua, Mantua, and other cities. Many of the soldiers who arrived to fight in the crusade were people who had been victimized by the cruel practices of Ezzolino in cities and regions he controlled. The Crusade's first major success came on June 19, 1256, when the forces of Azzo captured Padua. Ezzolino was occupied elsewhere, and the city, which had endured years of harsh rule, didn't put up significant resistance. The population had been terrorized for nearly 2 decades, and by 1256, many Paduans were simply waiting for liberation. The fall of Padua was a serious blow, stripping Ezzolino of one of his 3 major cities and signaling to the wider region that his grip on power was weakening. But the crusade didn't deliver a swift knockout. The years that followed were marked by messy, inconclusive fighting. The Crusader coalition was plagued by internal divisions, and its forces were scattered rather than concentrated, and Ezzolino remained a dangerous opponent. He also had an ace in his sleeve in terms of soldiers from the wider Holy Roman Empire who flocked to his banner to protect the interests of the empire in the region. In 1258, he captured Brescia after his German knights routed the Crusader army defending the city. He also reconciled with other Ghibelline-aligned lords, and together they launched a broad offensive across Lombardy and the Veneto region. But the tide of defections was running against him. Key allies, worn down by years of warfare and enticed by papal incentives, began switching sides. The coalition against Ezzolino grew, while his own support base shrank. His increasingly desperate behavior, including the reported mutilation of defenders at the castle of Priola near Vicenza in 1259, only reinforced the narrative that he was a tyrant. The end came in the autumn of 1259 when Ezzolino led his army into Lombardy and besieged the town of Orci Novi. The approach of Guelph forces forced him to abandon the siege and retreat across the Oglio River before fighting the Battle of Cassano d'Adda in September 1259. There, Ezzolino was wounded by an arrow during the fighting, and his forces were decisively defeated. He tried to escape, but in the aftermath he was captured and imprisoned. What happened next speaks to the character of the man. or at least to the legend that had been built around him. Ezzolino refused all food and medical treatment during his captivity. He died on October 7th, 1259, roughly 11 days after his capture. Whether this was a deliberate act of defiance, a refusal to submit to his enemies, or simply the result of his wounds, is something historians have debated. Ezzolino's death didn't end the violence, and his brother Alberico took up his mantle and vowed to continue the fight. However, without the glue that was Ezzolino, more defections occurred, and Alberico and his loyalists took refuge at his familial castle in the small town of San Zenone. In August 1260, Guelph forces from Venice, Trent, and other allied cities besieged and captured the fortress. What followed was one of the most horrifying episodes of the entire conflict, and Alberico was forced to watch his 6 sons hacked apart in front of him. The women of the family were met with even more horrific fates, before many of them were ultimately slain as well. Alberico himself was burnt with red-hot pincers and dragged through the streets of Treviso by a horse, and with that the entire da Romano family was extinguished. It was an act of vengeance so extreme that it shocked even a society well accustomed to brutal factional warfare. The Crusade against Ezzolino da Romano stands as one of the most striking examples of how the institution of crusading evolved during the 13th century. What began as a movement to reclaim sacred territory in the East had become a tool of papal politics within Europe itself. The crusade against Ezzolino wasn't really about heresy or defending the faith in any theological sense. Instead, the crusade was about breaking the power of the most formidable Ghibelline warlord in northern Italy, and from that perspective, the Pope was absolutely successful. Hey everyone, it's Jimmy, with a quick reminder to hit that subscribe button if you haven't done so already. Also, remember to check out the Patreon if you enjoy my content and want to support my channel further. Among the lesser-known episodes of the broader crusading movement, the story of Henry I of Mecklenburg stands out as one of the most dramatic. Known to history as Henry the Pilgrim, this 13th century German lord embarked on a journey to the Holy Land around 1271 and didn't return home for nearly 3 decades. But his tale isn't one of grand battles or sweeping conquests, which may be why his story is so obscure. But this doesn't mean it's not interesting and compelling, though in the end it's a deeply personal tale of perhaps the most insignificant serious crusade attempt in history. Henry was born around 1230, the eldest son of John of Mecklenburg. The House of Mecklenburg traced its origins to the Slavic Obotrite dynasty, which had been gradually absorbed into the feudal framework of the Holy Roman Empire. By the time of Henry's crusade, the family had been thoroughly Germanized. When Henry inherited power in 1264, he ruled alongside his brother Albert I, and Mecklenburg was a modest, but strategically positioned territory along the Baltic coast of Germany. When Albert died in 1265, Henry became sole lord and ruler of the domain, and from there he planned to participate in perhaps the most famous crusade that didn't involve the Holy Land. Henry wasn't new to holy war when he set out for Jerusalem, and he had acquired a reputation as a capable lord who was willing to do anything to spread the realm of Christendom. In 1270, he'd participated in a crusade against pagan Lithuania, fitting into the long tradition of northern crusades promoted by the Church. These crusades were largely spearheaded by the Teutonic Knights, one of the most famous crusader orders in history. The Baltic region in the 13th century was still home to significant non-Christian populations. The campaigns to convert or subdue them were considered legitimate crusading endeavors by Rome, and brought Henry immense personal prestige locally. However, at the end of the day, conquering a small piece of the Baltic coast didn't have the same appeal as carving out a realm in the Holy Land. With that in mind, in 1271, Henry turned his attention to the traditional heartland of crusading in the East. He set off on what some historians have classified as an armed pilgrimage to the Holy Land, though it remains unclear how many men he brought along with him. It's believed that he intended to offer his services to the Crusader states in the region and potentially conquer some land of his own, all while fulfilling his pilgrimage duty. Notably, though, the timing of Henry's expedition placed him squarely in one of the most dangerous periods for Christian adventurers in the eastern Mediterranean. The 1270s were a catastrophic decade for the remnants of the Crusader states, a fact that would make his likely plan a failure before he even departed. Sultan Baybars, the formidable Mamluk ruler of Egypt and Syria, had spent the previous years systematically dismantling Christian strongholds. Antioch had fallen in 1268, and the great hospitaller fortress of Crac de Chevalier was taken in 1271. The Ninth Crusade, led by Prince Edward of England, had arrived in Acre that same year, but couldn't reverse the tide. Christian pilgrims traveling through the region were at enormous risk, doubly so if they came under force of arms. It was somewhere along his route that Henry was seized and transported to Cairo, and the details of his capture remain frustratingly vague in the surviving record. What's known is that the Mamluks took him prisoner and held him in their Egyptian capital, where he'd remained for an astonishing 27 years. Contemporary chronicles describe him as held, quote, in vinculus in Babylonia, a Latin phrase referring to captivity in Cairo, which medieval European writers often called Babylon. This is naturally a reference to the period where the defeated Judeans were exiled to Babylon after the destruction of Jerusalem. Figuratively, medieval writers in essence meant this as a period of humiliation, where Henry was kept away from his homeland and potentially from elements of his faith. And I say potentially on the latter portion, since, as I'll explain, we actually don't know all that much about Henry's life while he was there. Whether Henry was kept as a political hostage, a potential source of ransom, or simply a forgotten prisoner among the many Christians swept up in the Mamluk campaigns, remains unknown. The Mamluk Sultanate under Baybars and his successors took large numbers of captives during their conquests. European captives of noble rank could sometimes negotiate release through ransom, but this doesn't appear to have happened quickly for Henry. His prolonged captivity suggests either that negotiations failed, that the ransom demanded was beyond what Mecklenburg could pay, or perhaps a third, more sinister option. Some historians have speculated that political turmoil back home made organizing his release exceedingly difficult, or that perhaps those in charge didn't really want him back. And given how the next nearly 3 decades played out, personally, I lean towards the latter option, for reasons that will become obvious shortly. Henry's disappearance created a serious governance crisis in Mecklenburg, and numerous competing factions within his family jostled for power. His wife, Anastasia of Pomerania, whom he'd married around 1259, was left to manage the territory alongside Henry's brothers, Nicholas III and John II. The situation quickly became contentious, and a dispute erupted among Henry's brothers and cousins over who should serve as regent. This disagreement was further fueled when they couldn't agree who should hold guardianship over Henry's heirs. John II administered affairs until his death in 1283, after which Nicholas III governed alone until 1290. By that point, Henry's eldest son, Henry II, had come of age and assumed co-regency alongside his mother and surviving uncle. The younger Henry eventually proved a capable and aggressive ruler, and would earn the nickname the Lion for his military exploits. But decades of fractured authority and infighting had taken their toll on the principality's stability, and the elder Henry wouldn't be returning until the young Lion was on the throne. Henry's release finally came around 1298, after approximately 27 years in Mamluk custody. The exact circumstances of his liberation are unclear, though he reportedly made his way home through Morea in the Peloponnese and then through Rome. From there, it's believed that he traveled over the Alps and through the entirety of the Holy Roman Empire's heartland before arriving back in Mecklenburg. By the time he returned, he was an old man in his late 60s, and the world he'd left behind had changed profoundly. In 1299, Henry formally resumed his title as Lord of Mecklenburg, though by all accounts he left the actual business of governance to his son, Henry II. After all, a man approaching 70 who'd spent nearly 3 decades in foreign captivity was unlikely to have the energy or political relationships needed to govern effectively. Henry I died on January 2, 1302, and was buried in the ducal crypt at Doberen Minster, the great Cistercian abbey that served as the traditional burial place for Mecklenburg's rulers. Henry the Pilgrim's crusade didn't reshape the map or change the course of history. He didn't lead anything more than a group of armed pilgrims, nor did he ever negotiate treaties with the burning remnants of the Crusader states like he imagined. But his tale captures something essential about the human cost of the crusading era. One man's decision to undertake a journey of faith led to nearly 3 decades of imprisonment and a succession crisis that destabilized his homeland. He returned to a world that had moved on without him, where he lived out his remaining days in complete obscurity. And perhaps that's what I find so fascinating about Henry the Pilgrim. In the grand narrative history of the Crusades, Henry is a footnote at best, but because of this, his story feels that much more personal.